The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Manchester as crowds began gathering hours before the scheduled royal visit. Sarah Thompson clutched her daughter's hand tightly, both of them wrapped in warm coats against the October chill. Around them, thousands of people pressed forward, their faces filled with anticipation and something deeper, a hunger for hope that had been missing from their lives for too long. The past 18 months had been devastating for this industrial city. The textile factory that had employed nearly half the community had closed its doors permanently, leaving families struggling to pay rent and put food on their tables. Local shops had shuttered one by one, their windows now covered with newspapers and for lease signs that nobody seemed interested in answering. The community center where children once played after school had been forced to reduce its hours due to funding cuts. But today was different. Today, Prince William and Catherine were coming to Manchester. Not for a ceremonial ribbon cutting or a brief handshake tour, but for something unprecedented in recent royal history. Word had spread through social media and local news that the royal couple had specifically requested to meet with families affected by the economic downturn. They wanted to hear real stories, understand real struggles, and most importantly, they had hinted at bringing real solutions. Margaret Wilson, a 73-year-old grandmother, had been standing in the crowd since dawn. Her weathered hands gripped a small handwritten sign that simply read, "Thank you for seeing us." She had raised 5 children in Manchester, watched her husband work 30 years at the same factory before it closed, and now she was helping too. Raise her grandchildren while her own children searched desperately for employment in a job market that seemed to have forgotten people like them. The crowd's energy was electric, but respectful. These weren't tourists hoping for a glimpse of celebrity. These were people who had been invisible for too long, suddenly feeling seen. Local police estimated over 15,000 people had gathered along the route from the train station to the community hall where the main event would take place. Street vendors who hadn't had customers in months found themselves overwhelmed with demand for hot tea and simple sandwiches. David Kumar, a 42-year-old former factory supervisor, stood with his teenage son James near the front of the barrier. David had been unemployed for 14 months, surviving on savings that had dwindled to almost nothing. His son had been accepted to university but couldn't afford to attend. The young man's dreams of studying engineering seemed to slip further away with each passing day. Yet today, father and son shared something they hadn't experienced in over a year: genuine optimism. The local council had worked with the royal advance team for weeks to ensure this visit would be different from typical royal engagements. Instead of carefully orchestrated photo opportunities with pre-selected individuals, William and Catherine had insisted on open forums where anyone could speak. They had requested detailed briefings about the specific challenges facing Manchester's working families. And their staff had spent considerable time researching successful community development programs from around the world. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew more diverse. Factory workers stood beside teachers who had been laid off due to budget cuts. Single mothers chatted with elderly pensioners whose community services had been reduced. Small business owners who had been forced to close their shops found themselves in conversation with young people who couldn't find their first jobs. Despite their different circumstances, they all shared a common thread. They had been struggling in silence. And today they felt heard before anyone had even spoken to them. The atmosphere was unlike anything the city had experienced in recent memory. Children who had grown accustomed to their parents' worried whispers now saw adults smiling and talking excitedly about possibilities. Local news crews captured images of neighbors embracing, sharing stories, and planning ways to support each other long after the royal visit ended. The gathering itself was becoming a healing experience for a community that had been fractured by economic hardship. Emma Rodriguez, a 35-year-old nurse who had been working double shifts to support her family since her husband lost his job, brought her 2 young children to the event. Her 6-year-old daughter, Lucy, had drawn a picture of a rainbow with the words "Hope for Manchester" written in crayon. Emma wasn't naive about the limitations of what any single visit could accomplish, but she recognized the power of acknowledgement. For the first time in months, she felt like her family's struggles mattered to someone beyond their immediate circle. The organizers had set up speakers throughout the gathering area, so everyone could hear what would happen during the main event. Local volunteers distributed bottles of water and information packets, about existing community resources that many people didn't know were available. The packet also included a survey asking residents about their most pressing needs and ideas. For community solutions, this wasn't just a royal visit. It was turning into an impromptu town hall where citizens could finally voice their concerns to people who might have the influence to create change. As the appointed time approached, the crowd's energy shifted from patient anticipation to focused attention. Mobile phones were held high, ready to capture what many sensed would be a historic moment for their community. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for better views. Elderly residents were helped to chairs that volunteers had brought from nearby buildings. The sound of approaching vehicles caused a ripple of excitement to move through the crowd like a wave. Police motorcycles appeared first, followed by the familiar sight of royal protection vehicles. But instead of the typical rushed arrival with minimal public interaction, the convoy slowed as it approached the gathering. Through the windows of the lead car, people could see William and Catherine looking out at the crowd with expressions that seemed to reflect genuine concern and interest rather than polite obligation. As the vehicles stopped, the crowd fell into a respectful silence, broken only by the sound of cameras clicking and children's voices asking their parents if they could see properly. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, but none of them could have predicted what would happen next. The royal couple would step out of their car and directly into the lives of people who had been struggling in silence for too long, creating a moment that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. When the car doors opened, William and Catherine stepped out in a way that immediately set this visit apart from any royal engagement the crowd had witnessed before. Instead of the usual formal procession behind security barriers, they walked directly toward the gathered families with genuine warmth radiating from their expressions. Catherine wore a simple navy coat that looked elegant but not extravagant, while William had chosen a casual blazer that made him appear more like a concerned neighbor than a future king. The first person they approached was 8-year-old Timothy Chen, whose mother had been holding him up so he could see over the adults. Timothy's father had lost his job at the automotive plant 6 months earlier, and the family had been living with Timothy's grandparents ever since. When Catherine knelt down to Timothy's eye level and asked about the small toy car he was clutching, the child's shyness melted away instantly. "My daddy used to help make cars like this one," Timothy explained in his small voice, holding up the red toy vehicle. "But now he's looking for a new job every day." Catherine listened intently, nodding as if this 8-year-old's words carried the weight of government policy, which in many ways they did. William joined the conversation, examining the toy car with genuine interest and asking Timothy about his favorite subjects in school. What happened next surprised everyone, including the royal protection officers who had to quickly adjust their positioning. William and Catherine began moving through the crowd, not in a structured receiving line, but in an organic, flowing conversation that seemed to draw them naturally from one family to another. They spent real time with each person they met, asking follow-up questions and showing the kind of engaged listening that made people feel truly heard. Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who had been working 2 part-time jobs since losing her full-time position at the department store, found herself in conversation with Catherine about the challenges of balancing work and childcare. Maria's oldest daughter, 15-year-old Sophia, had been helping care for her younger siblings after school instead of participating in activities she enjoyed. Catherine listened as Maria explained how she worried constantly about the impact of their financial stress on her children's future opportunities. "You're doing something incredibly difficult," Catherine told Maria, her voice carrying genuine admiration rather than pity. "Your strength is giving your children something more valuable than money. They're learning resilience and the importance of family." Maria felt tears beginning to form as she realized this wasn't empty comfort. Catherine understood the weight of responsibility that single parents carry. Meanwhile, William was engaged in an intense conversation with Robert Harrison, a 55-year-old man who had worked in manufacturing his entire adult life. Robert's calloused hands told the story of decades of honest labor. but his eyes held the frustration of someone who wanted nothing more than the dignity of earning his own living. His unemployment benefits were running out, and at his age, finding new employment felt nearly impossible. "The hardest part isn't the money," Robert explained to William. "It's feeling like you don't matter anymore, like all those years of work meant nothing." William nodded with understanding that surprised Robert. The prince spoke about economic transitions he had studied, but more importantly, he acknowledged the human cost of industrial change that policymakers often overlooked as the conversations continued. Something remarkable began happening in the crowd. People who had been strangers began talking to each other, sharing their own stories and offering support. The royal visit was creating connections between community members who had been struggling in isolation. Children who had been quiet about their families' difficulties at school found themselves playing together while their parents discovered they weren't alone in their challenges. Jennifer Walsh, a teacher who had been laid off when the local primary school was forced to reduce staff, found herself discussing educational challenges with both William and Catherine. She explained how children from financially stressed families were arriving at school hungry and unable to concentrate, creating a cycle where economic hardship led to educational disadvantage. Catherine asked detailed questions about specific programs that might help, taking notes on her phone with the intensity of someone planning to take action rather than simply expressing concern. The conversation that would later be remembered as the turning point of the visit began when William noticed Peter McGrath, a 70-year-old veteran who was standing slightly apart from the main crowd. Peter had served in the military for 22 years before working another 20 in civilian manufacturing. Now he was surviving on a pension that barely covered his basic needs, and his adult children were too financially stressed to provide much help. William approached Peter with the respect that one serviceman shows another. Their conversation began with shared military experiences, but quickly moved to Peter's current challenges. The elderly veteran explained how he had never expected to struggle financially after a lifetime of service and work. His voice cracked slightly as he described choosing between heating his home and buying adequate food during the winter months. "Sir," Peter said, using the formal address, but with a tone that conveyed deep emotion, "I'm not asking for charity. I just want to understand how we got to a place where people who work their whole lives can't afford to live with dignity." The question hung in the air not as an accusation, but as a genuine plea for understanding from someone who had given his life to serving his country. Catherine moved closer to join the conversation, and what happened next would be captured by dozens of cameras and shared millions of times on social media. Both William and Catherine were visibly moved by Peter's words. This wasn't the practiced sympathy of public figures. This was genuine emotional response to human suffering. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Peter describe the choices no elderly person should have to make. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Royal visits typically involved carefully managed interactions designed to avoid exactly this kind of raw, emotional moment. But William and Catherine had deliberately chosen to engage authentically, and the result was a connection that transcended their official roles. The moment when Catherine reached out and gently placed her hand on Peter's arm created a silence that seemed to spread through the entire crowd. In that simple gesture, something shifted in the atmosphere of the gathering. This was no longer a formal royal visit with predetermined outcomes. It had become a genuine human connection that was touching everyone present. "Peter," Catherine said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed crowd, "your service and your work have meant everything. The fact that you're facing these challenges now isn't a reflection of your worth or your contributions. It's something that needs to change, and we're here because we want to be part of that change." Her words weren't delivered as a political statement or a promise that might be forgotten after the cameras stopped rolling. They carried the weight of personal commitment. William stepped forward and did something that royal protocol would typically discourage. He embraced Peter in a brief but genuine hug, the kind shared between men who understand struggle and mutual respect. The crowd watched in amazement as their future king showed the kind of authentic emotion that people rarely see from public figures. When William stepped back, his own eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We came here today not to offer quick fixes or empty promises. William said, his voice carrying across the crowd through the speakers that had been set up. "We came because we wanted to listen, to learn, and to understand what real families are facing. But what we're discovering is that this community has something powerful. You have each other, and you have stories that need to be heard far beyond Manchester." The crowd began to murmur with appreciation, but what happened next transformed the entire gathering. A young woman named Lisa Parker, who had been standing near the back of the crowd with her infant son, began walking forward. Lisa was 26 years old, a single mother who had been working as a home healthcare aide until budget cuts eliminated her position. She had been hesitant to speak, worried that her situation wasn't important enough to warrant royal attention. "Excuse me," Lisa called out, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't want to interrupt, but I wanted to say something." The crowd parted to let her through, and Catherine immediately turned toward her with an encouraging smile. "Lisa's baby 6 months old." Michael was sleeping peacefully in her arms, despite the noise and excitement around them. "I've been listening to everyone's stories, and I keep thinking about my son," Lisa continued, her confidence growing as she saw the genuine interest in William and Catherine's faces. "I don't want him to grow up in a world where good people like Peter have to choose between heating their homes and eating. I don't want him to see his mother cry because she can't afford both rent and childcare. But I also don't want him to grow up thinking that struggling means you're not worthy of respect." Catherine moved closer to Lisa, drawn by the young mother's courage and the universal truth in her words. "What do you want for Michael?" Catherine asked gently. "If you could change anything about his future, what would it be?" Lisa looked down at her sleeping son, then back at Catherine with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I want him to grow up knowing that work has dignity, that communities take care of each other, and that asking for help isn't shameful. I want him to see that when people have power like you do, they use it to lift others up, instead of just talking about problems." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word of this unexpected exchange. Lisa's honesty was creating space for others to speak their own truths. An elderly woman named Dorothy Fletcher raised her shaking hand and called out, "I want my grandchildren to be able to afford to live in the neighborhood where they grew up." A middle-aged man named Ahmed Hassan, who had immigrated to Manchester 15 years earlier and built a small grocery store that he was now struggling to keep open, added his voice. "I want my daughter to see that her father's hard work mattered, even when times get difficult." One by one, people began sharing not complaints or demands, but hopes and dreams that had been buried under months or years of financial stress. A teenage girl wanted to go to university without putting her family in debt. A grandfather wanted to be able to take his grandchildren on small adventures without worrying about the cost. A woman who had started a small bakery from her home wanted to expand enough to hire some of her unemployed neighbors, William and Catherine. Listened to each voice with the same attention they had given to Peter and Lisa. They asked questions, remembered names, and made connections between different people's stories. What was emerging wasn't just a catalog of problems, but a portrait of a community with incredible strength and clear vision for what they wanted to build together. The conversation took another significant turn when James Morrison, a local a school student who had been standing with his unemployed father earlier, stepped forward with an idea that would later become central to the changes that followed this visit. "What if we could create something here that connects all of us?" James asked, his teenage voice cracking slightly with nervousness but carrying passionate conviction. "Like a place where people who have skills can teach others, where people who have jobs can help others find work, where families can support each other instead of just struggling alone." Catherine's face lit up with genuine excitement. "James, that's exactly the kind of thinking that creates real change. You're talking about building community strength from within, not just waiting for solutions to come from outside." She looked around at the gathered crowd. "How many of you would be interested in being part of something like that?" Hands began rising throughout the crowd, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. People were realizing that they weren't just sharing problems with sympathetic listeners. They were potentially creating solutions together. The royal visit was becoming a catalyst for community organization in a way that no one had expected. William pulled out his phone and began taking notes as people called out ideas and offered their skills. A retired teacher volunteered to tutor children whose families couldn't afford extra help. A former factory worker who had become skilled at home repairs offered to help elderly residents with maintenance they couldn't afford to hire out. A woman who had been running a successful online business from her kitchen table offered to teach others about digital marketing and e-commerce. The energy in the crowd was transforming from hopeful patience to active engagement. People were exchanging phone numbers, making plans, and discovering resources within their own community that they hadn't known existed. The royal visit was becoming secondary to the community connections that were forming. As the crowd's energy shifted from passive hope to active engagement, William made a decision that his security team had not anticipated. Instead of moving toward the community center for the planned indoor program, he asked the organizers to bring the microphone system outside so that this organic community meeting could continue in full view of everyone who had gathered. "This conversation is too important to move away from the people who need to be part of it," William announced to the crowd. "Came here to listen to you, and what we're hearing is that Manchester doesn't need rescuing from the outside. Needs support for the solutions you're already creating together." Catherine took the microphone next, her voice carrying across the gathered families with warmth and determination. "We've been to many communities facing similar challenges, but what we're seeing here today is something special. You're not just talking about problems or waiting for someone else to fix things. You're identifying your own strengths and figuring out how to support each other." The crowd responded with appreciative murmurs, but the real magic happened when Catherine made an unexpected announcement. "William and I want to do more than just listen today. We want to commit to being part of what you're building here, not as visitors who come and go, but as ongoing partners in making sure these ideas become reality." A hush fell over the crowd as people processed what they were hearing. Royal visits typically involve ceremonial activities followed by departure, with perhaps a charitable donation announced later through official channels. But Catherine was suggesting something unprecedented: ongoing royal involvement in community development. Thomas Bradley, a 40-year-old former construction supervisor who had been unemployed for 8 months, raised his hand with a question. That was on many minds. What does that actually mean? How would that work? His tone wasn't skeptical, but genuinely curious about the practical implications of royal support for grassroots. Community organizing. William stepped forward with an answer that demonstrated how seriously he and Catherine had been listening. "Thomas, you mentioned earlier that you have experience managing construction projects and training workers. What if we could help you access the resources to create a skills training program right here in Manchester? It's not a program designed by outsiders and impose on your community, but one created by people like you who understand what skills are actually needed and how to teach them effectively." Thomas looked stunned, but before he could respond, Catherine continued the thought. "And Lisa, you talked about wanting to expand your home healthcare work. What if we could help connect you with other healthcare workers who are underemployed and help you develop a cooperative model that serves elderly residents like Peter while creating sustainable employment for people like you?" The crowd was buzzing with excitement as people began to understand that William and Catherine weren't offering charity or temporary assistance. They were proposing to help amplify and resource the solutions that community members were already envisioning. Margaret Patel, a 52-year-old woman who had been running a food distribution program from her church for families struggling with food insecurity, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Your Royal Highnesses, I've been working with hungry families for 2 years now, using whatever donations we can gather and volunteers who help when they can, but we never have enough resources, and we can't help people with the underlying problems that create food insecurity in the first place." Catherine walked directly to Margaret, taking her hands in a gesture that cameras captured but that felt completely natural rather than staged. "Margaret, tell us about your program. What's working well, and what would help you expand the impact you're already having?" As Margaret began describing her food distribution network, other community members started adding their own observations and ideas. Someone mentioned knowing families who were too proud to accept food assistance, but might participate in a community garden project. Another person suggested connecting the food program with James's idea about skills sharing, so that people receiving assistance could also contribute their talents to the community. What emerged from this spontaneous community planning session was a vision that none of the participants could have developed alone. They were talking about creating an integrated support network where unemployed construction workers could help build community garden spaces, where retired teachers could provide childcare so single parents could attend skills training, where people receiving food assistance could learn about nutrition and food preparation. While contributing to the program's operations, William was taking detailed notes on his phone while also recording audio of the conversation. This wasn't typical royal protocol, but nothing about this visit was following typical patterns. "We want to make sure we remember everything you're telling us," he explained to the crowd. "These ideas are too important to lose or forget." Conversation took another significant turn when Dr. Rachel Williams, a recently laid-off social worker, mentioned that many of the challenges people were describing, unemployment, food insecurity, social isolation, lack of childcare, were interconnected. Problems that required coordinated solutions rather than separate programs addressing each issue individually. "What you're all describing," Dr. Williams said, her professional training evident in how she synthesized what she was hearing, is a model for community resilience that addresses root causes instead of just treating symptoms. You're talking about creating an economy within your own neighborhood that meets people's needs while utilizing everyone's skills. Catherine nodded enthusiastically. "Rachel, that's exactly right. And what's exciting is that this isn't theoretical for you. You're not talking about abstract policy ideas. You're talking about practical solutions that you're ready to implement with your neighbors." The energy in the crowd was reaching a crescendo as people realized they were participating in something historic. This wasn't just a royal visit that would be remembered for the emotional moments between William, Catherine, and individual community members. It was the beginning of a community organizing effort that had royal support and the potential to create lasting change. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. As the afternoon sun began to lower, casting golden light across the gathered families, a small group of children who had been playing at the edge of the crowd approached the center of the gathering. 10-year-old Emma Richardson, whose mother had been unemployed for over a year, walked up to the microphone with the fearless confidence that only children possess. "Can I say something?" Emma asked, her clear voice carrying across the crowd. When Catherine knelt down and adjusted the microphone to Emma's height, the little girl looked out at the sea of adult faces with complete composure. "I just wanted to say thank you for listening to our parents," Emma began, her words simple but profound. "At school, we don't usually talk about our families not having enough money because it makes us feel embarrassed. But today, all the grown-ups are talking about it like it's okay, like it's not our fault, and like we can do something about it together." Emma's words created a profound silence across the gathering as adults realized they were seeing their situation through the eyes of their children. The 10-year-old continued with the kind of wisdom that sometimes comes naturally to young people who have been watching and listening carefully to the adult world around them. "My mom cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking," Emma said, her voice steady but filled with the serious tone of a child who has seen too much worry. "She cries because she can't buy me new shoes when mine get too small, and because she can't take me to do fun things like we used to. But she shouldn't have to cry about that because she's a really good mom and she works really hard." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Emma, and she wasn't alone. Throughout the crowd, parents were looking at their own children with new understanding of how much their kids had been absorbing and internalizing about their family's financial struggles. The shame and isolation that had been weighing on the adults was also affecting their children in ways many hadn't fully recognized. William moved closer to Emma, speaking to her with the same respect he had shown the adults. "Emma, what would you like to see change for your mom and for other families here?" Emma considered the question seriously. Looking around at the crowd of neighbors she had grown up seeing but had never thought of as a community until today, "I think all the moms and dads should be able to help each other instead of feeling scared to ask for help. Like my mom is really good at fixing computers, but she's embarrassed to tell people because she doesn't have a job doing that anymore. But Mrs. Patterson's computer is broken, and she can't afford to take it to the repair shop." The simplicity and clarity of Emma's observations struck the adults like lightning. She was describing exactly what James had suggested earlier about skill sharing, but from a child's perspective that cut through all the complexity and self-consciousness. That adults bring to discussions about mutual aid, Mrs. Patterson. The elderly woman Emma had mentioned called out from the crowd, "Emma, I had no idea your mother knew about computers. I've been struggling with mine for months." The two had been neighbors for years, but had never had a reason to discover this potential connection. Emma beamed with pride. "I'm sighed. And my mom has been sad because she feels like she can't help anybody.
But she could help lots of people if they
Just knew what she was good at doing." Catherine stood up and addressed the crowd, her voice thick with emotion. "This is exactly what we've been hearing from all of you today. You have incredible resources within this community, skills, knowledge, experience, and most importantly, the willingness to support each other. What's been missing is the structure and support to make those connections happen naturally. What happened next would become the defining moment of the entire visit." William stepped forward and made an announcement that no one in the crowd was expecting, least of all his own security and communications team. "Catherine and I have been talking while we've been listening to all of you," William began, his voice carrying the weight of significant decision. "We came here today planning to make a charitable donation and offer our support for existing programs. But what we've heard has convinced us that this community is ready for something much more ambitious and much more transformative." The crowd held its collective breath as William continued. "We want to work with you to create a pilot program right here in Manchester, a comprehensive community resilience initiative that can serve as a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Not a program imposed from outside, but one developed by you, with ongoing royal support and resources." Catherine took over, outlining specifics that demonstrated how carefully they had been listening throughout the day. "We're talking about funding for the skills training center that Thomas described, resources for Margaret's food security program, to expand into community kitchens and gardens, support for Rachel's integrated social services approach, and most importantly, employment for community members to coordinate and manage these programs themselves." The crowd was buzzing with excitement, but Catherine wasn't finished. "This isn't charity, and it isn't temporary assistance. We're talking about investing in your community's capacity to create sustainable solutions to the challenges you're facing. We're talking about proving that communities have the wisdom and strength to solve their own problems when they have adequate resources and support." David Coomer, the former factory supervisor who had been standing with his son James earlier in the day, raised his hand with a question that reflected both hope and healthy skepticism. "This sounds incredible, but how do we know this will actually happen? How do we know you won't go back to London, and this will just become another story about a nice royal visit?" William smiled at David's directness. "David, that's exactly the right question to ask, and we're prepared to answer it with actions, not just words. Catherine and I are prepared to commit to visiting Manchester every 3 months for the next 2 years to participate directly in planning and implementation. We're prepared to use our platform to advocate for policy changes that support community-led development. And we're prepared to provide immediate funding to begin pilot programs within the next 30 days. The crowd erupted in applause, but William held up his hand to indicate he wasn't finished. "More importantly, we're prepared to ensure that this initiative is controlled by Manchester residents, not by royal staff or government bureaucrats. You will hire your own coordinators, design your own programs, and measure your own success. Our role is to provide resources and use our influence to remove barriers, not to manage or direct what you're building." Emma, who had started this phase of the conversation, tugged on Catherine's coat. When Catherine knelt down again, Emma whispered something in her ear that made Catherine smile through her tears. Catherine stood up and shared Emma's message with the crowd. "Emma just told me that she thinks this sounds like what happens when neighbors really become friends. They help each other not because they have to, but because they want to. What we're talking about is helping Manchester become the kind of community where children grow up knowing they're part of something bigger than their individual families, where adults can ask for help without shame, and where everyone's contributions are valued." The emotional power of the moment was overwhelming for everyone present. Now, this had begun as a formal royal visit and had transformed into something unprecedented, a genuine partnership between the royal family and a working-class community committed to creating systemic change together. But the most moving moment was still to come. when the community itself took ownership of what they were building together. As the golden afternoon light began to fade, something extraordinary happened that none of the carefully planned royal protocols had anticipated. The crowd of Manchester residents began organizing themselves into working groups right there on the street, while William and Catherine watched with amazement and growing emotion. Margaret Patel, the woman who had been running the food distribution program, found herself surrounded by a dozen people offering to help expand her efforts. Thomas Bradley was sketching plans on the back of a flyer, with 3 other unemployed tradesmen who were excited about the Skills Training Center. Lisa Parker, the young mother with baby Michael, was deep in conversation with 2 other healthcare workers about forming a care cooperative, but it was Peter McGrath, the elderly veteran whose struggle had moved William and Catherine to tears earlier, who provided the moment that would be remembered as the true culmination of this historic day. Peter walked slowly to the center of the gathering, his age and military bearing giving him a natural authority that caused conversations to quiet as people noticed him moving. "Your Royal Highnesses," Peter began, his voice stronger than it had been during his earlier conversation with William. "I've lived through a lot of changes in this country. I've seen communities torn apart by economic forces beyond their control. And I've seen people lose hope in ways that break your heart, but I've never seen anything like what happened here today." William and Catherine moved closer to Peter, drawn by the gravity in his voice and the recognition that he was speaking. "For the entire community, what I've seen today," Peter continued, his voice carrying across the crowd with the clarity of someone who had found his purpose again, "is people remembering that we don't have to face our struggles alone. I've seen neighbors discovering they have more in common than they realized. I've seen children like Emma reminding us adults about what really matters. I've seen 2 members of the royal family prove that leadership means listening, not just talking." Peter paused, looking around at the faces of his neighbors, people he had lived near for years, but had never really known until today. "But most importantly, I've seen this community remember its own strength. We've been so focused on what we've lost that we forgot about what we still have, each other." The crowd was completely silent as Peter turned back to William and Catherine. "You came here offering to help us, and we're grateful for that. But what you've really done is help us help ourselves. You've shown us that our problems aren't individual failures. They're shared challenges that require shared solutions." Catherine wiped tears from her eyes openly, no longer concerned about maintaining royal composure. This was a moment for authentic human emotion, and she felt honored to witness Peter's transformation from a man struggling in isolation to a community elder articulating their collective strength. Peter's voice grew stronger as he continued, "I want to make a promise, not just to you, but to everyone here. I may be 70 years old, but I'm not done contributing to my community. I have skills from my military service and my years